Some objects don't become valuable because of what they're made from. They become valuable because of the story they've been hiding for decades. The problem is, stories don't come with price tags. They often look like junk until someone curious decides to ask one more question than everyone else. That's exactly what happened during an ordinary estate auction when an old welded-shut toolbox rolled onto the stage. People dismissed it before the bidding even started. One man laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee when Keanu Reeves quietly offered $30 for it. They thought they were watching a foolish purchase. In reality, they were watching the first chapter of a mystery that had remained locked away for nearly 40 years. Before we continue, some of the greatest discoveries in history began because one person asked a question everyone else ignored. If stories about hidden secrets, quiet heroes, and unforgettable discoveries are your kind of adventure, consider subscribing before we continue. Because today, a $30 purchase is about to unlock far more than an old toolbox. Saturday mornings were sacred in the little farming town of Red Creek. Not because of church, not because of football, because of the estate auctions. People came from 3 counties away. Farmers looking for spare tractor parts, collectors searching for forgotten antiques, mechanics hoping to find old tools worth restoring, young couples hunting for cheap furniture, retired men who insisted they were just looking, even though they always drove home with something tied to the back of their trucks. The auctions weren't just about buying things. They were about stories. Every rusted wrench, every rocking chair, every faded photograph had once belonged to someone. Sometimes those stories disappeared forever. Sometimes they found a new owner. The Red Creek auction yard had looked almost exactly the same for 50 years. Rows of folding chairs stood beneath a long metal canopy. Old tractors lined one side of the yard. Stacks of furniture filled another. Boxes overflowed with tools whose original owners had long since passed away. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with engine oil and sun-baked wood. It wasn't elegant. Nobody expected it to be. That was part of its charm. At precisely 9 o'clock, a battered blue pickup rolled quietly into the gravel parking lot. No polished chrome, no oversized tires, no trailer, just an old truck that looked like it had earned every mile on its odometer. The driver climbed out. Keanu Reeves adjusted the sleeves of his faded work jacket before closing the door. He carried no shopping list, no notebook, no excitement, just quiet curiosity. The parking attendant smiled. "Morning." Keanu nodded. "Morning. You buying today?" "I'll know when I see it." The attendant laughed. "That's what you said last month. And you left with an old vise that looked ready for the scrapyard." Keanu smiled faintly. "It wasn't. What was wrong with it?" "Nothing. It just needed someone patient enough to clean it." The attendant shook his head with a grin. "You've got a strange eye." "So I've been told." Across the yard, an older woman waved enthusiastically. "Mr. Reeves." Keanu looked over. Margaret Ellis hurried toward him carrying 2 steaming paper cups. She was in her late 60s, a retired librarian. Sharp memory, gentle voice. She had attended nearly every auction for the past 15 years. Without asking, she handed him one of the coffees. The usual. Keanu accepted it. "You remembered. You always drink it black. You notice things." Margaret smiled. "I spent 40 years in a library. If you don't notice details, you shelve books in the wrong place." Keanu chuckled softly. "That sounds dangerous." "It is." She pointed toward the auction stage. "Anything you're hoping to find today?" Keanu looked around the yard. "No. What if something finds me?" Margaret laughed. "Still talking like that? It saves making predictions." The loudspeaker crackled to life. A cheerful voice echoed across the yard. "Morning, folks." Instantly, conversations quieted. People gathered beneath the canopy. Coffee cups found nearby tables. The day's auction was about to begin. Walking onto the stage was Harold Jenkins, 62 years old. Red suspenders, wide-brimmed cowboy hat, and a voice loud enough to wake neighboring counties. Harold had been calling auctions for nearly 30 years. He believed silence was bad for business, so he rarely allowed any. "Ladies and gentlemen," he spread his arms dramatically, "we've got everything today. Farm equipment, furniture, vintage signs, old coins, and enough mystery boxes to keep bad decisions alive until lunchtime." The crowd laughed. Harold smiled proudly. He loved making people laugh almost as much as he loved selling things. The first hour passed quickly. A cast-iron stove sold for $400. An antique sewing machine sparked a bidding war. A collection of hand tools brought more money than anyone expected. Keanu bid only once, on an old carpenter's square. He lost it by $5. He didn't seem disappointed. Margaret noticed. "You really wanted that?" Keanu shook his head. "I wanted to know who wanted it more." She smiled. "And I found out." Near the back of the yard, a heavy forklift slowly carried another group of items toward the stage. Most people barely glanced up. Old engine blocks, rusted barrels, bent shelving. Nothing unusual. Then, something caught Keanu's eye. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't rare. In fact, it looked like junk. A large steel toolbox, nearly 4 feet long, covered in rust. One side dented inward. Its faded green paint had almost disappeared beneath years of oxidation. A thick steel chain wrapped tightly around it. More unusual still, the lid had been welded completely shut. Not locked. Welded. The welds weren't neat. They looked hurried, almost desperate. Keanu quietly set his coffee down. Margaret noticed immediately. "What is it?" He didn't answer. He simply kept watching the forklift. The toolbox rattled once as it was lowered onto a wooden pallet. Not loudly, just enough to make Keanu tilt his head. Margaret looked at it. "Looks ruined." Maybe. Who would weld a toolbox shut? Keanu's eyes remained fixed on the old steel box. "I don't know." He paused. But people don't usually seal something forever, unless they have a reason. Harold spotted it next. He laughed into the microphone. "Well, here's today's ugliest item." The crowd turned. Several people immediately chuckled. Harold walked over and knocked on the rusty lid. Clang. Looks like somebody got tired of opening it. More laughter. One man shouted, "Sell it by the pound." Another added, "Scrap metal." Even Harold grinned. "I'd open it if I could." He pointed toward the thick weld bead running across the lid. But somebody made sure nobody ever would. The audience quickly lost interest. Collectors turned away. Farmers looked back at the tractors. Mechanics shrugged. Why bid on a toolbox nobody could even inspect? To most people, it was just a heavy box filled with uncertainty. And uncertainty wasn't worth paying for. Except, Keanu was still looking at it. Not the rust. Not the dents. The welds. Every bead. Every uneven line. Every place where the metal had been sealed. He slowly walked closer, knelt beside it, ran his fingertips lightly across the cold steel. Then, he noticed something that made him stop completely. Scratched into one corner of the toolbox, almost hidden beneath decades of rust, were 3 tiny letters. EMC. Keanu's expression didn't change, but his curiosity did, because those initials didn't look like an owner's mark. They looked intentional. Keanu continued studying the initials. EMC. Not curved with a pocket knife. Not scratched by accident. They had been stamped into the steel before the paint was ever applied. Factory markings. Maybe. Maybe not. He gently brushed away another layer of rust with his thumb. The letters were followed by a tiny symbol. A 5-pointed star enclosed inside a circle. Small enough that almost nobody would notice it. Margaret leaned closer. Find something. Keanu stood. Maybe. She squinted at the toolbox. I don't see anything. I wasn't sure you would. What is it? He smiled faintly. I'm still trying to decide. Harold looked down from the auction stage. Mr. Reeves. Keanu looked up. You planning to marry that toolbox? The crowd laughed. Keanu smiled politely. I'm just introducing myself. Harold grinned. Careful. It hasn't said hello back. Another wave of laughter rolled through the audience. Harold had spent decades reading crowds. If people laughed, they bid more freely. If they relaxed, they spent more money. Entertainment was half the job. A man wearing an expensive denim jacket stepped beside Keanu. His name was Carl Benton. Most people in Red Creek knew him. Carl bought estates for a living. He wasn't sentimental. If an item couldn't make him money, he walked away. He folded his arms. You're actually interested in that thing? Keanu looked at the toolbox again. I might be. Carl laughed. I've seen refrigerators in better condition. Keanu nodded. So have I. Carl crouched beside the toolbox. One quick look, then another. Finally, he stood. Nothing there. You sure? Carl shrugged. 40 years buying estates. I know junk when I see it. Keanu asked calmly. And how often has junk surprised you? Carl smiled confidently. Never. Keanu simply nodded. I hope today isn't the first. Carl laughed loudly enough for several nearby bidders to hear. A younger collector wandered over. What are you guys looking at? Carl pointed toward the welded lid. This. The young man frowned. Somebody welded it shut. Looks that way. The young collector bent over, tapped one corner with his boot. Hello. Carl nodded. Exactly. If there was anything valuable inside, whoever owned it would have opened it years ago. Another bidder joined them. Then another. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered around the toolbox. Not because they wanted to buy it, because they enjoyed watching people argue over worthless things. Harold noticed. He smiled to himself. Good. People were paying attention again. He stepped up to the microphone. Looks like our mystery box has fans. More laughter. He dramatically pointed toward the toolbox. I'll make you folks a deal. If anyone can open it right here, you get to keep whatever's inside. The crowd cheered. One burly mechanic immediately stepped forward. Move over. Harold laughed. That's the spirit. The mechanic grabbed the lid. Pulled. Nothing. He braced one boot against the pallet. Pulled harder. The toolbox didn't move. The chain rattled. The welds held. Someone shouted, "Try harder." The mechanic laughed. I'm trying not to throw my back out. Even Keanu smiled. Another man borrowed a pry bar from a nearby vendor. He wedged it beneath one corner, pressed down with all his weight. The steel groaned. The pry bar bent. The toolbox remained closed. Harold wiped imaginary sweat from his forehead. I think the box is winning. The crowd erupted again. Margaret looked toward Keanu. Still interested. More than before. Why? He watched the failed attempts quietly. Whoever sealed it. He paused. Didn't want time opening it. Margaret looked confused. What do you mean? Most locks keep people out. He nodded toward the welds. These were meant to stay closed. She frowned thoughtfully. I've never looked at it that way. Harold raised both hands. All right. Let's see if anyone actually wants to own the stubborn thing. The forklift operator carefully positioned the pallet beside the auction platform. The toolbox landed with a heavy thud. Dust drifted into the sunlight. Harold dramatically dusted off the top with his sleeve. It barely made a difference. Rust still covered almost every inch. He grinned. I've sold prettier scrap. He opened his bidding book. Who'll give me $10? Silence. People looked at one another. Nobody moved. Harold smiled. $5. Still nothing. Someone near the back yelled. You pay me $5, and I'll haul it away. The audience laughed. Harold pretended to look offended. Tough crowd. Carl folded his arms. Told you. No market. Keanu didn't answer. His attention had drifted back to the tiny initials. EMC. Something about them refused to leave his mind. Not because he recognized them. Because they didn't fit. Everything about the toolbox suggested hurried work. Bent corners. Crooked welds. Years of neglect. But those initials had been placed with precision. They belonged to another story. One older than the welds. Harold tried again. Come on, folks. It's got to be worth $10. One elderly farmer raised a hand. I'll give you $5. Harold pointed dramatically. We've got $5. Do I hear 10? Silence. The farmer shrugged. If not, I'll use it to store fence posts. A few people chuckled. Harold looked around hopefully. No 10. The room stayed quiet. Keanu slowly slipped one hand into his jacket pocket. Margaret noticed. So, you've decided. I think so. She smiled. I knew it. What gave me away? You stopped looking at the rust. What am I looking at now? The question. Keanu smiled. That's usually the expensive part. Harold sighed theatrically. Going once. The elderly farmer smiled. Looks like I've got myself a toolbox. Going twice. Before Harold could finish, a calm voice rose from the second row. 30. The entire auction yard fell silent. Harold blinked. 30. Keanu nodded once. $30. For 2 full seconds. Nobody said anything. Then Carl Benton burst into laughter. Not a polite chuckle. A loud, uncontrollable laugh that echoed across the yard. He slapped his knee. 30. He pointed at the rusted toolbox. You just paid 6 times what it's worth. Several others joined in. One mechanic shook his head. That's the worst bid I've seen all year. Another collector laughed. You could have bought 3 good toolboxes for that. Even Harold couldn't hide a grin. He looked toward Keanu. You sure? Keanu answered without hesitation. Yes. Harold looked around. Do I hear 35? Nobody even raised a finger. Carl laughed harder. Nobody's saving him from that mistake. Harold lifted the gavel. Going once. Going twice. He smiled. Sold. Bang. To the gentleman in the black jacket. The crowd applauded. Not because of the sale. Because they believed they just witnessed the funniest purchase of the day. Carl walked over, still laughing. He pointed at the toolbox. I hope whatever's inside. He paused, barely containing another laugh. Is worth at least $31. Keanu looked at the welded lid one last time, then quietly replied, I don't think what's inside is the most valuable thing about it. Carl's smile faltered for just a moment. Not because he believed Keanu, because the answer didn't sound like someone trying to justify a bad purchase. It sounded like someone who had already found something nobody else had noticed. Keanu walked toward the auction office without paying attention to the laughter behind him. It wasn't the first time strangers had laughed at one of his decisions. And somehow, it never bothered him. Harold stepped down from the stage, carrying the auction receipt. You know, he handed it over. I've been doing this a long time. Keanu accepted the paper. So I've heard. Harold smiled. 30 years. I've sold tractors with trees growing through them. Barns that were ready to fall over. Even a bathtub somebody claimed belonged to a movie star. He pointed toward the toolbox. But that might be the strangest thing I've ever watched someone willingly buy. Keanu folded the receipt and slipped it into his pocket. That's probably why I liked it. Harold laughed. I figured you'd say something like that. Carl still hadn't recovered. He walked beside them, shaking his head. I've got to ask. Keanu looked over. Ask? What exactly are you expecting to find? Keanu answered honestly. I don't know. Carl laughed again. So you paid $30 for something you know nothing about? Keanu nodded. Yes. Carl threw both hands into the air. You collectors are unbelievable. Keanu smiled faintly. I'm not a collector. No. I fix things. Carl looked at the welded lid. You planning to fix that? If it wants fixing. The answer earned another round of laughter from everyone standing nearby. The forklift operator drove over. A broad-shouldered man named Pete climbed down from the machine. You want me to load it? Keanu nodded. Please. Pete walked around the toolbox once, then whistled softly. Whatever's inside. It's heavy. Carl grinned. Probably bricks. Pete shrugged. Maybe. He slid the forklift forks beneath the pallet. The toolbox lifted slowly. Hydraulics groaned under the weight. Pete frowned. How? Harold noticed. What? Pete looked genuinely puzzled. For something that size, it's heavier than it should be. Carl waved dismissively. Rust weighs plenty. Pete scratched his beard. No. I move machinery every day. He looked at the steel box again. There's something unusual about the weight. Keanu quietly listened. He didn't say a word. Margaret joined them. You heard that? Keanu nodded. I did. You think there's something valuable inside? He looked toward the toolbox. I think somebody wanted nobody else to know. She smiled. That's different. It usually is. The forklift carefully lowered the toolbox into the bed of Keanu's pickup. The rear suspension dipped noticeably. Pete stepped back. I'd strap that down. I was planning to. Pete handed him 2 heavy-duty ratchet straps. These'll do it. Keanu reached for his wallet. Pete shook his head. Keep your money. They're old. So am I. Pete laughed. Then they'll suit each other. Keanu smiled. Thank you. As Keanu secured the toolbox, a small voice spoke from behind him. Mister. He turned. A boy of about 10 stood there holding a notebook. Baseball cap. Freckles. Grease on one cheek. He looked nervous. My grandpa says you're the man who bought the welded box. Keanu nodded. I did. The boy looked at the toolbox with wide eyes. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why?" Several nearby adults smiled. Even Carl stopped walking. They wanted to hear the answer too. Keanu tightened the last strap before replying. "When everyone else walks away from something." He looked at the boy. "I like to understand why." The boy thought about that. "So, you're curious?" Keanu nodded. "Curiosity has saved me from making assumptions." The boy smiled. "My teacher says assumptions get people in trouble." "Your teacher sounds wise." The boy grinned proudly. "She is." The boy's grandfather walked over. "Sorry." He asks everybody questions. Keanu smiled. "That's a good habit." The old man looked toward the toolbox. "You know, I remember seeing one like that years ago." Keanu immediately looked up. "You do?" "Maybe." "When?" The old man rubbed his chin. "Long time back. 30, maybe 35 years. Carl rolled his eyes. "Here we go." The old man ignored him. There used to be a machine shop outside town. Old Mr. Ellison owned it. He built custom equipment. The name caught Margaret's attention. "Ellison." She frowned. "The engineer." The old man nodded. "That's him." Margaret looked surprised. "I remember reading about him." "He disappeared." The old man slowly nodded. "That's what people said." Carl laughed dismissively. "Everybody disappears eventually." "No." The old man looked serious. "He walked out one morning, and nobody ever saw him again." The laughter faded. Even Carl stopped smiling. Keanu looked back at the toolbox. "Ellison." The old man nodded. "I can't swear that's his. It's just." He pointed toward one corner. "I remember that faded green paint. And toolboxes like that weren't common." Keanu crouched beside the truck. His eyes returned to the initials. EMC. Ellison Machine Company. Ellison Manufacturing Corporation. Or something else entirely. He wasn't ready to guess. "Not yet." Harold suddenly hurried over carrying a clipboard. "Hold on." Everyone turned. Harold flipped through several pages. "That's odd." Margaret looked at him. "What?" Harold frowned. "The paperwork." "What paperwork?" "The estate inventory." He tapped one page with his finger. "This toolbox wasn't listed." Pete looked confused. "What do you mean?" Harold flipped another page. "I mean, every item from today's auction has a number. Everything. The tractors, the furniture, the antiques, the tools." He looked toward the rusty box. "But not this." Carl laughed. "So somebody forgot." Harold slowly shook his head. "No. Forgotten items don't get auction tags." Everyone looked at the small paper tag hanging from the chain. Harold pointed. "That tag was attached yesterday." Margaret frowned. "So who added it?" Harold looked genuinely confused. "I don't know. I thought Pete did." Pete immediately shook his head. "I've never seen that thing before this morning." A strange silence settled over the group. Carl tried to laugh again. It didn't sound nearly as convincing. "So, somebody dropped off an old toolbox. What's the big deal?" Harold looked down at the clipboard one more time, then quietly said something that made Keanu's attention sharpen completely. "No." He slowly closed the folder. Nobody dropped it off. Everyone stared at him. Harold swallowed once before continuing. "It was already sitting in the middle of Lot 7. When we unlocked the gates at sunrise. Nobody knew where it had come from. Nobody had signed it in. Nobody had claimed ownership, and according to every employee working the auction, nobody had seen anyone bring it there. Keanu looked at the welded toolbox, then at the strange initials stamped into its steel. For the first time that morning, he wasn't wondering what was inside. He was wondering who wanted someone to find it. The parking lot had almost emptied. Most buyers were already loading furniture, tractors, and antique cabinets onto trailers. Laughter still drifted across the auction yard. More than once, Keanu heard someone joke, "There goes the $30 toolbox." He simply smiled. People were free to think whatever they wanted. Curiosity had never required permission. Harold looked at the rusty toolbox once more. "I've checked these records 3 times. He held up the inventory clipboard. "It isn't here." Pete frowned. "So somebody made a mistake." Harold slowly shook his head. "No. A mistake is forgetting to write something down." He pointed toward the auction tag hanging from the chain. "This tag came from my office." Margaret looked confused. "Meaning?" Harold answered quietly. "Someone had access to my auction supplies." Silence settled over the small group. Carl immediately shrugged. "So somebody played a prank." Pete folded his arms. "Maybe." Harold didn't look convinced. "No. Pranks usually have punchlines." Keanu walked slowly around the pickup. He stopped beside the toolbox once again. This time, he wasn't looking at the welds. He was looking underneath. Years of dirt, surface rust, old scratches. Nothing unusual. Until he noticed 4 deep grooves carved into the bottom rails. Not random scratches. Wear marks, perfectly parallel, as though the toolbox had spent years sliding into the exact same place. Again, and again, and again. Margaret noticed him crouching. "What now?" Keanu gently brushed away packed dirt. This box wasn't sitting in someone's garage. She frowned. "How can you tell?" He pointed toward the grooves. It spent years mounted somewhere. "Mounted?" He nodded. "Truck, workshop, factory, but not sitting loose." Carl looked over. So whoever welded it shut." Keanu stood. Didn't stop using it. Carl's smile faded slightly. He hadn't thought of that. Pete scratched his beard. "You know, I've hauled thousands of toolboxes." He looked at the rails underneath. "He's right. They don't wear like that sitting on concrete." Harold slowly looked back toward the clipboard. This gets stranger by the minute. Just then, an elderly woman approached the truck, pushing a small folding shopping cart. White hair, floral dress, walking cane. Margaret smiled. "Mrs. Donnelly." The old woman nodded politely. "I heard people talking." Her eyes settled on the toolbox. For several long seconds, she simply stared. Then, very quietly, she whispered, "Oh." Nobody spoke. The expression on her face had changed completely. Not surprise. Recognition. Keanu gently asked, "You've seen it before?" Mrs. Donnelly didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, one careful step at a time. Her wrinkled fingers lightly touched the faded green paint, almost affectionately. Then, without warning, she began crying. Margaret immediately supported her arm. "Evelyn, what is it?" The elderly woman wiped away a tear. "I never thought I'd see it again." The small group exchanged glances. Keanu remained silent, giving her time. After nearly a minute, Mrs. Donnelly finally spoke. "My husband. He worked with a man named Edward. The initials, EMC. Keanu listened carefully. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. But everyone said. She smiled through her tears. There wasn't a machine he couldn't build. Carl frowned. Edward what? Evelyn. The old woman closed her eyes. Edward Michael Carter. Keanu's eyes returned to the initials. EMC. Not a company. Not a factory. A name. Harold quietly repeated it. Edward Michael Carter. Pete looked thoughtful. I've heard that name. Carl shook his head. I haven't. Mrs. Donnelly smiled sadly. Most people your age haven't. She looked toward the toolbox. But 40 years ago, he was one of the finest welders in the state. Keanu asked softly, what happened to him? The smile disappeared. He vanished. Again. Another disappearance. Margaret noticed it too. First Ellison. She looked at Keanu. Now Carter. Mrs. Donnelly slowly nodded. They were best friends. The silence deepened. Carl crossed his arms. So 2 old mechanics disappeared. What does that prove? Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Mrs. Donnelly gently pointed toward one corner of the toolbox. There. Everyone looked. Near the handle, barely visible beneath rust, were tiny burn marks, perfectly round. She smiled faintly. Edward always rested his welding torch there. Pete bent down. I'll be. Those aren't rust marks. They're heat scars. Mrs. Donnelly nodded. He refused to buy a stand. He always joked. She laughed quietly despite the tears. That steel could survive a little more fire. Keanu smiled. He sounds practical. He was. Carl still looked unconvinced. Fine. So it's his toolbox. People lose things. Mrs. Donnelly looked directly at him. He never lost that toolbox. Never. Why? Because. She hesitated. It was the last thing his father gave him before he died. The laughter disappeared completely. Even Carl stopped arguing. Keanu looked toward the heavy weld bead sealing the lid. If it meant that much. He paused. Why weld it shut? Mrs. Donnelly slowly shook her head. I don't know. He never would have. Her answer raised even more questions. If Edward Carter hadn't welded it, who had? A pickup truck suddenly pulled into the auction yard much faster than it should have. Gravel sprayed behind its tires. The truck stopped abruptly beside Harold's office. A man jumped out before the engine even stopped. Mid-50s. Oil-stained shirt. Out of breath. He looked around frantically. Harold. Harold turned. Tom. The man hurried over. I got your message. Harold frowned. What message? The one about the toolbox. Silence. I never sent one. Tom stopped. What? You called me an hour ago. Harold slowly shook his head. No. I've been running the auction all morning. Tom reached into his pocket. He pulled out his phone. It came from your office number. Harold stared at the screen, then looked toward his office. Nobody had been inside all morning. Pete quietly muttered, That's impossible. Tom finally noticed the toolbox sitting in Keanu's truck. His face immediately changed. Color drained from it. He took one slow step backward. No. Keanu looked at him. You know it. Tom nodded. I built those welds. Nobody moved. Not even Carl. Harold spoke first. You welded this box shut. Tom swallowed hard. His voice barely rose above a whisper. 42 years ago. The entire parking lot fell silent. Keanu calmly held his gaze, then asked the question everyone else was thinking. Why? Tom looked at the toolbox, then at the people gathered around it. His hands had begun to shake. I promised. He struggled to finish the sentence. I'd never tell anyone. Tom Carter couldn't take his eyes off the toolbox. 42 years. 42 years had passed. Yet he recognized it immediately. Not because of the rust. Not because of the dents. Because of the welds. He had made every one of them. His hands began trembling. I promised. I'd never tell anyone. Nobody spoke. The auction yard had become strangely quiet. Even people loading furniture onto trailers had stopped to watch. Harold carefully stepped closer. Tom, what are you talking about? Tom didn't answer. Instead, he reached out toward the toolbox. His fingertips hovered just above the steel. He never actually touched it, almost as though he believed doing so would wake old ghosts. Keanu watched him carefully. Not pushing, not interrupting. People remembered more. When they weren't rushed. Finally, Tom took one long breath. I was 24. Edward was my foreman. He wasn't just the best welder I'd ever met. Tom smiled faintly. He was the best man. Mrs. Donnelly quietly wiped another tear. That sounds like Edward. Tom nodded. He taught every apprentice the same rule. What was it? Tom looked toward Keanu. If you build something, build it so someone else can trust it with their life. Pete quietly whispered. That's exactly what my grandfather used to say. Tom looked at him. Your grandfather probably learned it from Edward. Carl folded his arms. So I weld his toolbox shut. Tom's smile disappeared. I didn't. Silence. Carl frowned. You just said. Tom interrupted. I welded it. He looked at the old steel box. Because Edward asked me to. That changed everything. Harold slowly removed his cowboy hat. Why? Tom looked around the auction yard, as if making sure nobody else was listening. Then he quietly answered. Because he believed. Someone was coming. The words settled heavily over the group. Margaret frowned. Coming. Tom nodded. He wouldn't tell me who. He just kept saying. Tom's voice became softer. If they get here before I'm back. I seal it. Keanu remained completely still. His mind had already begun putting pieces together. Someone. Fear. A welded toolbox. 2 missing men. Nothing fit yet. But it was beginning to. Carl shook his head. This doesn't make sense. Tom looked at him. It didn't then either. I thought he'd lost his mind. What happened next? Tom stared at the ground. He never came back. Nobody said a word. The wind gently pushed dust across the parking lot. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across the valley. Tom continued. I waited 2 days. Then 3. I kept expecting him to walk through the shop door. Mrs. Donnelly smiled sadly. So did all of us. Tom nodded. On the 4th day, I did what he'd asked. His eyes returned to the welds. I stayed all night. I cleaned the edges, burned every seam closed. When I finished, he swallowed. I cried. Margaret quietly squeezed Mrs. Donnelly's hand. Keanu finally asked, Did you know what was inside? Tom immediately shook his head. No, Edward never showed me. He only said. Tom closed his eyes, remembering. If you know what's inside, you'll be tempted to tell someone. Carl frowned. So you welded a box shut. Without even looking. Tom looked directly at him. I trusted him. The answer silenced Carl completely. Pete slowly walked around the truck. So what's the plan? He looked toward Keanu. "We cut it open." Tom's head snapped up. "No." Everyone looked at him. "No." Tom pointed toward the welds. "Not with a torch." Pete frowned. "Why not?" "You'll destroy whatever's inside." Keanu noticed something. "You left space." Tom looked surprised. "What?" "The weld bead." Keanu pointed carefully. "You never welded directly against the lid." Tom stared at him. For several seconds. He simply smiled. "You saw that?" Keanu nodded. "You expected someone to open it one day." Tom's smile grew. Edward expected it. Pete crouched beside the toolbox. "I'll be." He traced the weld with one finger. "He's right." Carl leaned down. "What?" Pete pointed. "See this tiny gap?" Nobody else had noticed it. The weld sealed the lid, but it hadn't fused the lid itself. Instead, a heavy steel band had been welded over the opening. Tom looked at Keanu with genuine admiration. "I've met engineers. Who would have missed that?" Keanu smiled faintly. "I repair old things. They leave clues." Harold scratched his head. "So, it can be opened?" Tom nodded. "Yes." Pete looked confused. "Then why didn't you tell anyone 40 years ago?" Tom laughed quietly. "Because nobody ever asked." The answer lingered in the air. Nobody had asked. Everyone had simply assumed. Assumed it was permanently sealed. Assumed it was worthless. Assumed there was no story left. Only one man had looked twice. Margaret quietly smiled at Keanu. "You were right." He looked at her. "About what?" It wasn't the box. It was the question. Just then, an old green station wagon rolled slowly into the auction yard. Nobody paid much attention. Until it stopped. An elderly man climbed out carrying a weathered leather satchel. His back was slightly bent. His white beard reached almost to his chest. He looked around the yard, then froze. His eyes locked onto the toolbox. The satchel slipped from his hand. It landed heavily on the gravel. He whispered only 2 words. "Dear Lord." Tom slowly turned. The color drained from his face. "No." Mrs. Donnelly looked equally stunned. "It can't be." Harold frowned. "You know him?" Tom nodded slowly. "I thought." "He died." The elderly stranger began walking toward them. Slowly, carefully. His eyes never left the toolbox. When he finally reached the truck, he stopped, raised one trembling hand, then gently rested it against the rusted steel. A tear rolled down his cheek. Without looking away, he quietly said, "I told Edward. Someone kind would eventually find it." Keanu looked at the old man. "Who are you?" The stranger finally turned. His tired eyes met Keanu's. "My name is Samuel Ellison." The entire group froze. Mrs. Donnelly covered her mouth. Harold nearly dropped his clipboard. Even Carl forgot to speak. Because according to everyone in Red Creek, Samuel Ellison had disappeared 42 years ago. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound in the auction yard was the wind rattling an old flag above Harold's office. Samuel Ellison stood motionless beside the pickup. His wrinkled hand rested gently on the welded toolbox, almost like he was greeting an old friend. Tom Carter stared at him in disbelief. "No." His voice cracked. "It really is you." Samuel slowly looked up. His tired eyes searched Tom's face. Then, a faint smile appeared. "You've gotten old." Tom laughed through his tears. "So have you." The 2 men embraced. Not dramatically. Not like men who needed attention. Like brothers who had spent 42 years believing the other chapter of their lives had already ended. Mrs. Donnelly wiped another tear from her cheek. "I went to your funeral." Samuel smiled sadly. "I know." Harold looked completely lost. "Hold on. You've been alive this whole time." Samuel nodded. "Yes." Carl finally found his voice. "Then where have you been?" Samuel looked toward the hills surrounding Red Creek. "Far away." "Doing what?" "Keeping a promise." Keanu quietly watched. Samuel wasn't answering questions to impress anyone. Every answer was careful, measured, like a man who had spent decades deciding which truths were safe to tell. Harold folded his arms. "You disappeared without telling your family." Samuel lowered his head. "I did. People searched for you." "I know. They thought you were dead." Samuel closed his eyes briefly. "I know." Harold sighed. "Why?" Samuel looked toward the toolbox. "Because some promises cost more than comfort." Carl shook his head. "I don't buy it." Samuel looked at him kindly. "You don't have to. I'm serious. You disappeared for 42 years because of a toolbox." Samuel quietly corrected him. "No. I disappeared because of the men looking for it." Silence. Pete frowned. "What men?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Keanu. "You noticed the initials?" Keanu nodded. "I did." "You noticed the welds?" "Yes." "You noticed the rails underneath?" "Yes." Samuel smiled. "Edward would have liked you." Tom looked confused. "Sam, you said you'd never come back." Samuel nodded. "I wasn't planning to." "What changed?" Samuel looked directly at Keanu. "He bought it." Carl laughed nervously. "That's the reason." Samuel nodded. "I've been watching auctions for 20 years." Everyone stared. "You've been..." "What?" Samuel smiled faintly. "Waiting." Margaret looked puzzled. "For what?" Samuel answered simply. "For the right person." Carl threw up his hands. "Come on. You expect us to believe you somehow knew he'd buy it?" Samuel shook his head. "No. I hoped." Keanu finally spoke. "You've seen other people bid on it." Samuel nodded. "Many. Why not let them have it?" Samuel looked around the group. "Because they wanted what might be inside." Then, he looked directly at Keanu. "You wanted to know why it existed." No one argued. "Because it was true." Harold scratched his head. "So, you left it at the auction?" Samuel nodded. "Before sunrise." Harold blinked. "That was you?" "Yes. But I checked the cameras." Samuel smiled. "You checked after 7." Harold frowned. "We don't turn them on until opening." Samuel nodded. "I know." Pete burst into laughter. "You planned the whole thing." Samuel shrugged. "I had one chance." Carl crossed his arms. "So you've been hiding for 42 years. Waiting for someone curious." Samuel looked at him. "No. I was waiting for someone patient." The sentence stayed with Keanu. Patient. Not clever. Not wealthy. Not famous. Patient. Samuel slowly opened his old leather satchel. The worn hinges creaked softly. Inside were dozens of yellowed envelopes, old photographs, handwritten notebooks tied with faded string. He carefully removed one photograph. It showed 2 young men standing beside a machine shop. One held a welding helmet. The other smiled with grease covering both hands. Edward Carter. Samuel Ellison. Much younger. Much happier. Samuel handed the photograph to Keanu. He insisted we take that picture. Keanu studied it quietly. On the workbench behind them sat the same green toolbox, without chains, without welds, just another ordinary toolbox. Margaret smiled. It looks brand new. Samuel nodded. It was. Keanu looked more closely, then stopped. Something caught his attention. He pointed toward the photograph. Who's that? Everyone leaned closer. Standing in the background, barely visible through the workshop doorway, was a young boy, no older than 12, holding a bicycle. Samuel smiled warmly. My son. The smile disappeared almost immediately. He'd be 54 now. Margaret looked confused. You haven't seen him. Samuel quietly shook his head. Not since the day I disappeared. The words landed heavily. Even Carl looked away. Tom swallowed. You sacrificed your family. Samuel looked down. No, I lost them. There was a difference. Keanu understood it immediately. So did Tom. Samuel carefully placed the photograph back into the satchel, then looked at the welded toolbox. I've carried the weight of that decision every day. He gently rested his hand on the steel again. But Edward was right. Harold frowned. Right about what? Samuel smiled. One day, someone would come looking for the story. He looked at Keanu. Not the treasure. Pete grabbed a flashlight from his truck. If we're opening it. He looked toward Tom. How do we do it? Tom walked to the toolbox. He ran his fingers slowly along the heavy steel band welded across the lid. Then, he stopped at one tiny spot near the back corner. So that's where I left it. Everyone leaned in. What? Tom smiled. Edward always said, never make something impossible to undo. He pointed toward a tiny circular plug, almost invisible beneath layers of rust. It isn't welded. Pete frowned. What is it? Tom answered quietly. The key. Carl laughed. A key. Tom nodded. Not for opening the box. He looked toward Keanu. For removing the weld. The group exchanged puzzled looks. Tom reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small folding knife. Using the tip, he carefully scraped away 40 years of rust from the tiny metal plug. Then he looked at Keanu. Would you do the honors? Keanu stepped forward. Tom handed him the knife. Twist it. That's all. Tom smiled. Edward never believed complicated things lasted. Keanu carefully inserted the blade into the small slot. Everyone unconsciously held their breath. He turned it slowly. At first, nothing happened. Then, a soft metallic click echoed from somewhere inside the toolbox. Pete's eyes widened. What was that? Tom smiled. The first lock. Before anyone could say another word. The heavy steel band wrapped around the toolbox suddenly shifted. Barely a fraction of an inch. And for the first time in 42 years, the welded-shut toolbox had begun to open. Nobody breathed. The faint metallic click seemed impossibly loud. It echoed inside the old toolbox, then faded into silence. Every eye remained fixed on the heavy steel band wrapped around the lid. For 42 years, people had believed it had been welded shut forever. Now, it had moved. Only a fraction of an inch, but enough to prove something extraordinary. Edward Carter hadn't built a prison. He had built a puzzle. Pete slowly leaned closer. I don't believe it. Tom smiled. He never trusted ordinary locks. Keanu looked at the loosened steel band. So the welds. Tom nodded. We're never meant to fool a welder. They were meant to fool everyone else. Carl blinked. What? Tom gently tapped the thick steel strip. If someone tried cutting the welds, they'd destroy what Edward was protecting. But someone patient, he looked toward Keanu, would eventually notice the clues. Keanu quietly smiled. He expected curiosity. Tom shook his head. No. He expected kindness. Harold looked confused. Kindness. Tom nodded. He believed greedy people rush. Caring people observe. Samuel smiled proudly. That's why I waited. Keanu carefully rested both hands on the heavy steel band. Does it lift? Tom shook his head. Not yet. He pointed toward the opposite corner. There's another one. Everyone looked. Hidden beneath another layer of rust was a second tiny metal plug, almost invisible. Pete laughed quietly. I would have never found that. Tom smiled. Edward would have taken that as a compliment. Keanu scraped away the rust, inserted the tip of the folding knife, then slowly turned it. Another click. This one louder. Deep inside the toolbox, several hidden metal pins retracted one after another. Click, click, click. The sound reminded Samuel of something. He closed his eyes. He built that mechanism during lunch breaks. Tom smiled. He said nobody appreciated beautiful engineering anymore. Carl stood completely still. The laughter from earlier was gone. In its place, wonder. He quietly looked toward Keanu. You knew. Keanu looked over. No. You acted like you did. Keanu smiled faintly. I only knew one thing. What? Nothing this carefully built is ever ordinary. Carl lowered his eyes. For the first time that day, he realized he'd spent an entire career judging things too quickly. Tom nodded toward the steel band. Lift. Keanu wrapped both hands around it. It was surprisingly heavy. Slowly, he raised it away from the toolbox. The entire steel frame lifted free in one piece. Not broken, not cut, simply unlocked. Pete let out a low whistle. I've never seen anything like that. Harold laughed in disbelief. We've been making fun of this thing all morning. Samuel quietly replied. Most people laugh at what they don't understand. Only the original toolbox remained. Still old, still rusty, but no longer imprisoned beneath steel. For the first time, the lid itself was visible. Keanu noticed something immediately. There wasn't a single lock. Instead, a brass handle sat quietly in the center, waiting, as though Edward had always known. One day, someone would reach this moment. Samuel's voice became softer. Go ahead. Keanu looked at him. You should. Samuel smiled. No. My part ended 42 years ago. He gently nodded toward the toolbox. This belongs to you now. Keanu hesitated. I didn't earn it. Samuel answered immediately. You earned the right to ask. The crowd had grown. Word had spread across the auction yard. People abandoned trailers, left furniture half-loaded, walked over carrying coffee cups. Nobody laughed anymore. Even the children stood quietly. The mystery had become everyone's story. Keanu slowly wrapped his fingers around the brass handle. It felt smooth, unlike everything else on the toolbox. Edward had polished it, again and again, probably hundreds of times, ready for the day someone finally opened it. Keanu took one slow breath, then gently lifted. The lid rose without resistance. No creaking, no grinding, as though it had been opened yesterday. Everyone leaned forward. Inside, There were no piles of gold, no stacks of cash, no jewels, nothing that made people gasp from greed. Instead, everything was perfectly organized, exactly as Edward had left it. A neatly folded canvas cloth covered the contents. On top of it sat a handwritten envelope, cream-colored, yellowed with age. Across the front, written in careful blue ink, were only 7 words. To the person who opened this. Nobody spoke. Keanu carefully lifted the envelope. It felt surprisingly light. Samuel quietly wiped another tear. I remember him writing that. Tom nodded. He made me promise never to read it. Keanu looked towards Samuel. You should. Samuel slowly shook his head. If I read it, I'd be reading someone else's gift. He smiled warmly. It was never meant for me. Keanu carefully unfolded the letter. The paper crackled softly. The handwriting remained remarkably clear. He began reading aloud. If you're reading this, then 2 things happened. First, you were patient enough not to destroy my work. Second, you cared more about understanding than owning. If both are true, then I already trust you. The auction yard became completely silent. Even the brays seemed to disappear. Keanu continued. People spend their lives looking for things worth money. Very few spend their lives looking for things worth remembering. If you've opened this box hoping to become rich, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. Carl quietly smiled to himself. I deserved that. Nobody disagreed. Keanu read on. The real treasure inside this toolbox isn't hidden beneath a false bottom. It isn't buried under steel. It's sitting right in front of you. Every tool inside was made by hand. Every one solved a problem people said couldn't be solved. If you use them to help someone. Otherwise, close the lid and leave them for the next curious soul. Keanu slowly lowered the letter, then gently folded back the canvas cloth. The crowd leaned in. Resting inside wasn't an ordinary collection of tools. Each wrench, each caliper, each measuring gauge, each handcrafted hammer had Edward Carter's initials engraved by hand. None of them were factory-made. Every single one had been custom-built. Tom's eyes widened. He kept them, Samuel whispered. Every prototype. Pete slowly picked up one small wrench. His hands immediately began trembling. I've seen pictures of this. Harold frowned. What? Pete looked at him in disbelief. This adjustable head. He swallowed. Modern manufacturers copied this design in the 80s. Another mechanic carefully lifted a strange measuring tool. My grandfather talked about these. They were decades ahead of their time. Carl looked around the toolbox in stunned silence. The collection wasn't valuable because it contained precious metals. It was valuable because it contained the life's work of a man whose inventions had quietly shaped an entire trade. Samuel smiled through tears. He wasn't building tools. He was building better ways for ordinary people to work. Keanu looked down at the toolbox, then back at Edward's letter. For a long moment, he didn't say a word, because he finally understood. The greatest thing hidden inside the welded-shut toolbox was never the tools. It was the character of the man who made them. No one reached for another tool. No one spoke above a whisper. The auction yard, usually filled with shouting bidders and rattling trailers, had become as quiet as a library. Every person standing around the pickup truck understood they weren't looking at expensive collectibles. They were looking at a man's life, one carefully built piece at a time. Pete slowly placed the adjustable wrench back exactly where he'd found it. Almost reverently. I wouldn't even know how to price this. Harold laughed softly. You can't. Pete looked at him. No. I mean, he swallowed. I literally can't. He pointed toward the handcrafted tools. They're one of one. There aren't any others. Carl stood with his hands in his pockets. For nearly 5 minutes, he hadn't made a single joke. Finally, he looked at Keanu. I owe you an apology. Keanu glanced over. For what? Carl smiled awkwardly. I laughed. I mocked you. I thought you'd wasted $30. Keanu looked back into the toolbox. You weren't laughing at me. Carl frowned. I wasn't. No. You were laughing at something you didn't understand. Carl thought about that, then nodded. I guess I was. Samuel carefully lifted one of the handmade measuring gauges. His fingers trembled. I helped polish this. Tom smiled. I remember. We worked until midnight. Samuel laughed quietly, and Edward refused to go home. He said, Tom finished the sentence. Machines sleep enough for all of us. Both men laughed, the kind of laughter only old friends understood. Margaret looked around the toolbox. There must be 50 tools. Tom nodded. 53. Everyone turned. You counted them. Tom smiled. Edward made us count them every Friday. Why? He said. Tom chuckled. If one disappeared, it probably meant someone needed it. Even after 42 years, Edward still sounded alive through the stories. Keanu carefully lifted another envelope from beneath the canvas. Smaller than the first. No writing on the front. Only Edward's initials stamped into the wax seal. Samuel's expression changed immediately. I've never seen that one. Tom shook his head. Neither have I. Keanu looked at Samuel. You mind? Samuel smiled. You've opened every other door. Don't stop now. Keanu carefully broke the old wax seal. Another handwritten letter. This one shorter. He unfolded it, then quietly began reading. If you've reached this letter, then you didn't stop after finding the tools. Good. Curious people usually keep looking. Several people smiled. Edward somehow seemed to know exactly who would eventually open the toolbox. Keanu continued. The tools are only half the reason this box exists. Look beneath the false tray. Pete frowned. False tray. Everyone looked inside again. Tom leaned closer. I forgot. He carefully lifted the wooden divider, holding the smaller tools. It came free. Hidden beneath it was another compartment, much deeper than anyone expected. Harold whispered, I'll be. Inside the hidden compartment rested 3 objects. A thick leather journal, a rolled-up bundle of blueprints tied with faded red ribbon, and a small square wooden box, no bigger than a cigar box. Samuel immediately recognized it. I made that. Pete smiled. You. Samuel nodded. Edward hated fancy cases, so I built him one. Carl looked toward Keanu. Go ahead. This time, nobody laughed. Nobody rushed him. The entire crowd had learned patience. One discovery at a time. Keanu picked up the leather journal first. The cover was badly worn. Corners rounded. The pages swollen from age. Inside, every page was filled with sketches. Measurements. Ideas. Failed experiments. Improved designs. Some pages contained coffee stains. Others had greasy fingerprints pressed into the paper. Edward hadn't tried to keep it perfect. He'd tried to keep it useful. Pete quietly turned one page. His eyes widened. No way. Harold frowned. What? Pete pointed toward one drawing. This locking wrench. He looked around. I own one. Carl blinked. So? Pete looked stunned. It wasn't invented until 12 years later. The crowd fell silent again. Samuel smiled sadly. Edward never patented anything. Margaret looked surprised. Why not? Samuel answered. He believed ideas belonged to whoever could use them. Carl stared. He gave them away. Tom nodded. More times than I could count. Pete slowly shook his head. He could have been rich. Samuel laughed softly. People told him that every week. What did he say? Samuel smiled. Enough is easier to carry than more. Keanu looked down at the journal. He could almost hear Edward speaking. Then, Keanu carefully untied the faded ribbon around the blueprints. Several large engineering drawings rolled open across the tailgate. Pete immediately stepped closer. Then another mechanic. Then another. Nobody said anything for almost 30 seconds. Finally, one of the mechanics whispered, These aren't just tools. Pete nodded. No, they're complete workshop systems. Harold scratched his head. What does that mean? Pete looked amazed. It means. He pointed across the drawings. This one man redesigned almost an entire machine shop. Another mechanic looked towards Samuel. Did anybody ever build these? Samuel quietly answered. No. Why not? They disappeared with him. Carl looked back at Keanu. You just bought 40 years of engineering history. For $30. Keanu smiled faintly. I bought a toolbox. Carl laughed. You still won't admit it. I don't need to. Then, Keanu reached for the final object. The small wooden box. Unlike everything else, it wasn't dusty. Samuel frowned. That's strange. Tom nodded. It should have aged. Keanu gently turned it over. On the bottom, carved neatly into the wood, were the same 7 words. Open this only after understanding everything else. Nobody moved. Margaret quietly smiled. Even now. He's still teaching. Keanu rested the small box back inside the toolbox. Carl looked confused. Aren't you opening it? Keanu shook his head. Not yet. Why? He looked at the carved message. Because I haven't understood everything else. Samuel stared at him, then slowly smiled. For the first time that day, he knew beyond any doubt. Edward had been right to wait. Because after 42 years, the toolbox hadn't simply found someone curious. It had found the exact person it had been built to find. Nobody reached for the wooden box. Not because they weren't curious. Because they finally understood something Edward Carter had spent his entire life trying to teach. Some things deserved patience. Keanu gently placed the small wooden box back into the hidden compartment. Carl couldn't help himself. You really are going to wait? Keanu smiled. It waited 42 years. I think it can wait another few minutes. Several people quietly laughed. Not at him. With him. Harold looked around the auction yard. Something had changed. The auction was over. The crowd should have gone home. Instead, nearly everyone who had attended was still standing around one old pickup truck. Nobody complained. Nobody checked their watches. Nobody talked about money anymore. They talked about Edward, a man half of them had never met. Pete carefully turned another page of the leather journal. His eyes widened. Look at this. The mechanics gathered closer. Edward hadn't simply drawn inventions. He'd written beside every sketch. Not measurements. Lessons. One page read, if a tool saves 5 seconds but breaks after 5 years, build another one. Another. The strongest weld is the one nobody notices because it never fails. Another, build every tool as though your own son will someday depend on it. Pete quietly closed the journal. He wasn't writing about steel. Samuel smiled. No, he was writing about people. Margaret looked toward Keanu. I think that's why you bought it. Keanu looked up. I didn't know why this morning. You do now. He nodded once. I think so. Carl slowly sat on the tailgate of his own truck. I've spent 30 years chasing valuable things. Nobody interrupted. He looked toward the toolbox. I've bought watches, coins, classic cars, military antiques. He laughed quietly. And today, he looked at Keanu. I almost walked away from the most valuable thing I've ever seen. Keanu gently corrected him. No. Carl frowned. What? You almost walked away from the best story. Carl smiled. You're right. Samuel carefully picked up one of Edward's handmade hammers. He held it the way someone holds an old photograph. I remember this one. Tom laughed. He broke 3 handles making it. Samuel nodded. He refused to sell it. Pete looked confused. Why? Samuel smiled. He said, if my own hammer hurts my hand, imagine what it'll do to someone else. Pete looked down at the perfectly shaped wooden grip. He kept redesigning it. 7 times. Carl quietly shook his head. He chased perfection. Samuel looked at him. No. He chased usefulness. Just then, a black SUV slowly entered the auction grounds. Unlike the others earlier that day, nobody paid much attention until 2 men stepped out. Dark suits, leather briefcases. One carried a camera. The other held a thick folder. Harold frowned. They're not from around here. The taller man walked toward the crowd. Excuse me. His voice was polite. I'm looking for the person who purchased a green steel toolbox. Carl looked toward Keanu. There he is. The stranger smiled warmly. You must be Mr. Reeves. Keanu nodded. I am. My name is David Foster. He extended his hand. I'm with the National Museum of American Industry. Several mechanics exchanged surprised looks. The museum. David nodded. We received a phone call less than an hour ago. Harold looked confused. From who? David smiled awkwardly. We don't know. It was anonymous. Samuel quietly looked away. Keanu noticed, but said nothing. David opened the thick folder. Inside were old black and white photographs, engineering reports, patent records. He carefully removed one photograph. It showed Edward Carter standing beside one of his inventions. David smiled. We've been searching for Edward Carter's original workshop for nearly 18 years. Pete blinked. 18. David nodded. Most people have never heard of him. But among manufacturing historians, he looked at the toolbox. He's considered one of the greatest unknown innovators of the 20th century. Carl stared. You've got to be kidding. David slowly shook his head. I'm not. He carefully spread several documents across the tailgate. Many modern tool manufacturers unknowingly copied his designs. Universities teach principles he discovered. Several patents filed by larger companies appear to be based on his unpublished work. Pete looked stunned. How do you know? David smiled. Because we found references, but never the originals. He looked toward the toolbox. Until now. The crowd became completely silent. Harold looked at Samuel. You knew. Samuel nodded slowly. I had an idea. You never told anyone. Samuel looked toward the hills beyond the auction yard. Edward didn't want fame. David gently interrupted. We know. Everyone looked at him. We interviewed dozens of people who knew him. They all said the same thing. He smiled. Edward believed the greatest reward was watching someone else's work become easier. Pete laughed quietly. That sounds exactly like him. David carefully looked at Keanu. Mr. Reeves, I know legally everything inside this toolbox belongs to you. Keanu nodded. It does. David hesitated. I'd like to ask a favor. What kind? The museum would like the opportunity to preserve Edward Carter's work. The crowd waited. David continued. We're not asking for a donation. We'll pay whatever you believe is fair. Carl quietly whispered. Here it comes. Harold nodded. Now we'll find out what it's worth. David closed the folder. Our board has already approved an initial offer. He looked directly at Keanu. $1 million. The auction yard froze. Pete's flashlight slipped from his hand. Harold's cowboy hat nearly fell off. Carl's mouth opened, but no words came out. Even Margaret looked stunned. $30 to $1 million in a single afternoon. David smiled. It's only an opening offer. Samuel slowly closed his eyes. Not because of the money, because Edward's work would finally be seen. All eyes turned toward Keanu, the quiet man who had paid $30 for a welded-shut toolbox. The crowd expected excitement, celebration, disbelief. Instead, Keanu calmly looked back into the toolbox. His eyes rested on the small, unopened wooden box. Then he looked at David. I can't answer yet. David frowned politely. May I ask why? Keanu smiled faintly. Because I haven't finished meeting Edward. The crowd fell silent once again. The $1 million offer suddenly felt less important than the little wooden box that still sat unopened inside the toolbox. And for the first time that day, everyone realized the greatest discovery might still be waiting. The entire auction yard stood frozen. $1 million. Only hours earlier, people had laughed at a $30 purchase. Now, professional historians had driven across the state, offering a fortune for the same rusty toolbox. Yet the man who owned it didn't even look at the contract. His eyes remained on the small wooden box. David Foster cleared his throat. Mr. Reeves, I understand this is unexpected. Keanu smiled politely. It is. Our board is prepared to wait. I appreciate that. David glanced toward the unopened wooden box. May I ask what's inside? Keanu answered honestly. I don't know. Then why not open it? Keanu looked at the carved message once more. Open this only after understanding everything else. He smiled faintly. I think Edward meant that. Samuel quietly nodded. He always did. Tom gently rested both hands on the tailgate. Edward hated shortcuts. Pete laughed. I think we've all figured that out. Samuel smiled. He believed every answer should be earned. Keanu slowly picked up the small wooden box. Unlike the toolbox, it wasn't heavy. It fit comfortably in both hands. The wood had darkened with age. The corners were smooth from years of careful handling. Whoever built it had loved doing so. Samuel smiled quietly. I remember making those dovetail joints. Pete examined them. They're perfect. Samuel chuckled. Edward made me redo them twice. Why? He said. Samuel laughed softly. One day someone will notice. Keanu looked at the joints. I did. Samuel smiled. I knew you would. There was no lock. No hidden mechanism. Only a simple brass latch. Keanu looked toward Samuel. You sure? Samuel nodded. It's time. Keanu gently lifted the latch. The lid opened with almost no sound. Inside rested only three things: a small brass key, a faded photograph, and one final envelope. Nobody moved. Keanu picked up the photograph first. It showed Edward Carter and Samuel Ellison standing outside the old machine shop. But this wasn't the photograph they'd already seen. Standing between them was a little boy, holding one of Edward's handmade hammers with both hands, smiling proudly. On the back, someone had written, "Build things that outlive you." Samuel looked away. His son. Keanu nodded. He picked up the brass key. Old, hand-filed, beautifully made. Pete looked puzzled. What does it open? Samuel slowly smiled. I finally know. Keanu unfolded the final letter. The paper was newer than the others. Edward must have written it last. His handwriting looked slower, less steady. Keanu began reading aloud. If you've reached this letter, then my toolbox survived longer than I expected. That makes me happier than you'll ever know. A few people quietly smiled. Keanu continued. You may have expected money, or gold, or something worth selling. I'm sorry to disappoint you. Carl laughed softly. You never disappoint people, Edward. Keanu kept reading. The world already has enough people chasing fortunes. It will always need more people willing to leave something useful behind. Nobody spoke. Even David Foster lowered his eyes. The next paragraph was shorter, but it changed everything. If Samuel is still alive, tell him I kept my promise. Samuel covered his mouth. Tears rolled freely down his face. I knew you would. He whispered it almost to himself. Keanu looked at Samuel. What promise? Samuel struggled to answer. Finally, he smiled through the tears. We made one when we were boys. What was it? Samuel looked toward the hills beyond Red Creek. We promised that no matter what happened, our work would always help people we'd never meet. Pete quietly wiped his own eyes. I think you did. Keanu continued reading. The brass key doesn't belong to me. It belongs to Red Creek, behind the old machine shop. There's a small stone workshop everyone believes is empty. It isn't. Harold blinked. The stone building. Samuel looked stunned. It survived. Harold nodded. Barely. Edward's letter continued. Everything I couldn't fit inside this toolbox, I left there. Not for collectors. Not for museums. For apprentices. For students. For anyone willing to learn with dirty hands and an honest heart. The auction yard fell silent again. David Foster slowly smiled. I don't think he wanted a museum. Keanu looked at him. I don't think so either. He finished the letter. If you've come this far, then I've got one last favor to ask. Don't remember me because I made good tools. Remember me because I tried to leave the world easier to work in than I found it. If you do that too, we'll have been friends even though we never met. Edward Carter. Keanu slowly folded the letter. Nobody said a word. There wasn't anything left to say. Several minutes passed. Finally, David closed his folder. Mr. Reeves. Keanu looked up. The museum's offer still stands. Keanu nodded. I know. David waited. So, what would you like to do? Keanu looked at the people surrounding the pickup. Samuel, Tom, Harold, Pete, Margaret, Carl, the little boy who had asked him why he bought the toolbox. Then, he looked at the brass key. I'd like to make a different deal. David smiled. I'm listening. The tools. They belong where people can learn from them. David nodded. I agree. The journal should be preserved. Absolutely. The blueprints should be digitized and made free. David looked pleasantly surprised. Free. Keanu smiled. Edward spent his life giving ideas away. I don't think he'd want people buying them now. David slowly closed his folder, then extended his hand. You've just made every curator on our board very happy. Keanu shook it. And Edward. David looked at the toolbox. I think he'd be smiling the most. 1 month later, the old stone workshop behind Edward's machine shop opened for the first time in over 4 decades. Not as a museum, as a community workshop. Retired mechanics volunteered beside young apprentices. Students learned to weld, to repair, to build. Above the entrance, a simple wooden sign hung over the door. It didn't mention money. It didn't mention fame. It simply read, "Leave it better than you found it." Samuel taught every Saturday morning. Tom repaired old tools. Pete donated equipment. Carl quietly paid for new workbenches. He never put his name on a single one. Harold held charity auctions to fund scholarships. Margaret organized the workshop library. The little boy with the baseball cap became the first apprentice. And every visitor who entered stopped in front of one display. Not because it held the most valuable item, because it held the simplest one. A rusty green toolbox, still scratched, still dented, still carrying the marks of a lifetime's work. Beside it, a small card read, purchased for $30. Its true value was never what it contained, but the kind of person it was waiting for. Late one afternoon, Keanu quietly walked through the workshop. No cameras, no speeches, no celebration. The little boy looked up from his workbench. Mr. Reeves. Keanu smiled. Yes. The boy held up a crooked metal bracket he'd been trying to make. It isn't perfect. Keanu examined it carefully, then handed it back. No. The boy looked disappointed. Keanu smiled again. But someone can trust it. The boy's face lit up. Keanu looked around the workshop one last time. People learning, people teaching, people helping strangers they might never meet again. Edward Carter had been gone for 42 years. Yet his greatest creation had never been a tool. It had been a way of thinking. Keanu quietly slipped his hands into his jacket pockets, then walked out into the afternoon sun. He had arrived at the auction looking for nothing. He left having found something priceless. Not inside the toolbox, but inside the story it had protected all along.